Good afternoon. I'm glad you could join us today. Our topic, the e-commerce quandary, how much should I charge for shipping, is one of the most frequently asked questions I field in my daily client interactions. With the explosive growth of e-commerce, it is a question, if answered properly, that can drive sales, improve the customer experience, and drive your profitability. At the end of this presentation, there'll be a time for a few questions. If you would like to ask anything, please type your questions when we have reached the end. I will answer as many as time permits. If we don't get to yours, we will answer all remaining questions via email, as well as provide a link to a recording of this session. And now, the e-commerce quandary. How much should I charge for shipping? Our learning objectives today are to answer the following questions. One, we're going to explore the current shipping charge environment for both B2B and B2C shipments and look at how that environment has evolved over the years. We're also going to take a look at how your strategy was developed and how do you know it was the right one. We're going to look at the steps to improve that strategy. We're going to look at the various strategies which shippers have adopted, what works when, and we're going to look at what tools or resources are needed to implement and execute an effective strategy. First, a little about LJM. We've been in business since 1998. We have more than 1,100 clients nationwide, ranging from very small $500,000 shippers up to enterprise shippers of close to $1 billion in spend. This gives us a very broad market perspective in the challenges that shippers face today. We've negotiated over 40,000 contracts. I feel a little old as I say that, from both the carrier and shipper's perspective. And we're typically negotiating 25 to 35 at one time, which again gives us a great market perspective and understanding what is occurring in the market at any particular point in time. And the carrier pricing groups are very well represented in our staff. We're also considered a thought leader in the industry. A little bit about myself. I've been doing this for 26 years, including a 16-year tenure at UPS, during which my final 8 years was in the UPS pricing department. During that time, I analyzed, developed, and implemented UPS pricing and costing models. I looked at thousands of UPS agreements and competed against thousands of FedEx, DHL, and post office agreements. And for the last 10 plus years, I've been doing this, helping shippers streamline their supply chain and make sure that they're delivering the best experience at the lowest cost to their customers. Now, let's take a look at the evolution of shipping charges, B2B shipping in the good old days. First, shipping charges were almost always expected. Free shipping was practically unheard of 10 years ago in the B2B environment. Variability in shipping rates was tolerated. It was not uncommon to pay $20 for a shipment one week and $22 for the next week, and there was rarely a complaint about that. Charges could often be presented after shipment arrival. It wasn't uncommon that a purchasing company would not even know what the shipping charges were until they'd received the goods and received the invoice. Oops. And then additional fees for handling, packaging, expedited, often went unquestioned. They could be applied and rarely was there a complaint. In today's environment, shipping charges must be consistent and predictable. Variance in rates won't be tolerated, and they need to be the same time after time after time. They need to be transparent and immediately known. They need to be reasonable and justified in the eyes of the shipper. And in some cases, you really can't charge for shipping at all, even in the B2B environment today. Now, how have things evolved in the B2C environment, or the pre-Amazon days, as we call them? First of all, charges, again, were expected. If you ordered something either through a mail order catalog or even in the early days online, you expected to pay for that delivery. Charges were very mysterious and unquestioned. Most consumers did not know what drove cost, and they just accepted whatever those charges were. Ancillary charges were also tolerated, packaging charges, handling charges, and paying for speed was expected. If a consumer wanted their goods quickly, they expected to pay a premium for that. Now, in the post-Amazon environment, Free or flat rate shipping is often expected and many times mandatory. Speed is expected, yet a lot of times customers are not willing to pay for that extra speed. They want that delivery in 2 days and they don't want to pay extra for it. Consumers are much more educated on cost drivers. Oftentimes consumers expect to pay extra if they're getting a mattress, but they don't expect to spend a handling charge if they're getting a book. And acceptance of those ancillary fees, with very few exceptions, has really disappeared from the market. All right, so how do customers come up with what they should be charging, either their B2B shipments or their B2C shipments? So this is what we hear when we talk to the myriad of shippers that we work with on how they derived their current pricing strategy and what they're going to charge their customers to deliver their goods. So first, one of the most common is we just matched our competitor's rate. Now, this is certainly an important component of pricing strategy, but if this is the only metric that was used to determine what should be charged, then there are potential landmines all over the place. Not being profitable, perhaps you don't know that your competitor is charging an appropriate rate. So while this is an important piece to developing your pricing strategy, to rely wholly on this really can be dangerous. We hear this a lot. We felt we had to offer free shipping. And in many cases, that may be true. In some cases, it may not be true. If it's not data supported, it really needs to be evaluated. And then if it is decided that free shipping is required, the question becomes, how can that really be supported? Do there need to be adjustments in product cost, in delivery schedules, in delivery method, et cetera, to support the cost of that free shipping? We hear this one all the time. We pass on our actual carrier rates. Now, this has some advantages and some disadvantages. We're going to talk about those at length as we come up a little bit later. Another is we pass on our rates with an upcharge, and this carries some of the same positives and negatives. Again, we'll go into those in more detail later. And then one we hear often is we get a blank stare, or we hear what strategy? And there's oftentimes folks have no idea really how it was derived, or it was derived years ago and hasn't been looked at, and the methodology used then is very outdated. So the key things here is multiple criteria, multiple variables really need to be considered to come up with an optimal strategy. Okay, the primary problem we see with current strategies is most customers cannot answer these basic questions when it comes to their pricing strategy. So the first is, what is your level of profitability or loss on shipping overall, per product category, per SKU? It amazes me how often folks just do not have this information. It's not uncommon for a shipper to know this holistically. So they might be able to tell us, hey, we lost $200,000 last year on shipping. But to break that down, to understand whether they lost on every package, whether they lost on every product category, or whether it was very specific, usually that information is not available. Is your pricing strategy driving away customers, either due to level, structure, or presentation? Often all the conversations that shippers have around shipping pricing is just that, the price, not the way the structure is, not the way it's presented to the customers, the way it's communicated. None of those things are typically talked. It's always the actual cost, and there could be problems with the structure or the presentation and not the cost that's causing you to lose customers. And then how would a change in either level or structure affect your sales or your bottom line? Has there been any type of testing or research into this? And most customers can't answer those questions. Now, I want to show you a few examples of what some shippers do, and I'm going to pick on one particular shipper. We've removed the customer information here, but you'll get a sense of there's so much going on here. So here is a shipment, an order from this shipper. In this case, the shipper is passing along actual shipping charge And in this particular item, the shipping charge is twice as much as the cost of the item itself. Well, very few consumers are going to tolerate that type of math. And so really the strategy along this particular item really needs to be reviewed. And if we look at the one below it, again, here's a pass-through environment where they are passing through the cost of the shipment that they are going to incur with the carrier to their customer. Now, whereas the math on this one works much better, again, it's a little convoluted and it's not terribly easy to understand how that rate was derived for the consumer. Here's another item through the same shipper, and here you can see that they've been offered free shipping based on the value amount. So this is one shipper, 3 different items where we have basically 3 different views into their pricing, and that's an awful lot for a typical consumer to be able to understand. And then here's another one which is very typical, which is just flat rate shipping, where there's a flat rate charged no matter the good. And again, these are just examples of very common pricing practices. Okay, so how do we take a look at your current strategy and move it to a level of success? How do we evaluate it? And we're going to go into all these points in a little more detail as we move through. But first, of course, you need to evaluate the effectiveness of the method that you're using now. Is it effective? Is it appropriate? And maybe it is. Maybe no changes are needed whatsoever. But that's the first thing that needs to be done, is the evaluating of that effectiveness. Second, plausible adjustments or alternative strategies really can be developed, but they have to be developed that are data-driven and market-driven. So come up with a few potential solutions that are different than what you're doing currently, but we don't want them to just be brainstorming sessions. We want them to be based on data and research. Then, and this is absolutely critical, and this is where most organizations really kind of fall off the tracks, and that's testing these potential strategies for effectiveness. Most of the time, the strategies are thought up, they're discussed, they're decided on and implemented with no testing, and we're going to go through that in a minute. Then adjustments to that strategy need to be made based on the results of those tests. And they can be tweaks, they can be wholesale changes, they may be changes to price level or changes to structure. But the more robust the testing protocols are, the better the adjustments will be and the more effective the final strategy will be. Then finally, implement the new strategy, put that into place across the organization, and then maybe most importantly is develop some key metrics for continuously evaluating the program effectiveness. What could be a very good program today could really fall flat in the future based on either market changes, what are your competitors doing, or product mix changes, or just consumer attitude changes. So there really needs to be looked at repeatedly to make sure it's still effective. Okay, so when we're evaluating the effectiveness, what do we look at? First, it's critical to understand the profitability, not first as a whole. So we want to look at your shipping as a whole compared to what you're spending with the carrier versus what you're bringing in from your customers. Then look at by client. If you're a B2B shipper, this is usually individual clients. If you're a B2C shipper, it's usually client categories. We also want to look at by product categories and then by order. So does your profitability, either a profit or a loss, does it change by product type? Does it change by order amount, by order type, by order frequency? Those types of evaluations really need to be made. I'm going to give a few examples. This is with an actual customer that we worked with. So first, this is their data at an aggregate level. So here we took a look at their information. And in so doing, we broke down, you'll see they had about 1,300 shipments. They spent $41,000 with UPS. And during that time, they collected $39,000 from their customers. So you can see that there's clearly a gap here. This is also interesting. Again, same spend, $41,000. Predicted spend is what their shipping system told them this amount would be. So you can see that the technology they're using to execute their shipments, their shipping system, underestimated what UPS would charge them by $1,400 or 3.5%, or $1.16 per package. So there's a significant issue here with the fact that their shipping system is not able to accurately predict what UPS is going to charge them. So if they're using a pass-through method or a pass-through with an upcharge method, they are going to lose money, even though that method is designed for you not to lose money. Then what we did here was break down the number of shipments, because they did lose money overall, as you see, but they did not lose money on every shipment. Of their shipments, they lost money on 979 shipments, but they made a profit on 291 shipments. So they lost money on, they lost 11.8% on the shipments where there was a loss, but they profited 5.3%. So overall, they lost 6.5% on their shipping. So that's a pretty significant gap. And what that equates to is $2.14 per order. Okay, so again, these are the type of metrics that really need to be understood in evaluating your current strategy's effectiveness. Oop, there we go. Sorry about that. Okay, then what we did was we broke their profit and loss down by product category. So these are the different products they were shipping. These are the top products where they lost money. So you can see that these three items, this is the percentage loss they had. Here you can see these are their most profitable items, because sometimes you may only need to fix certain product categories or maybe even specific SKUs in order to return your organization to profitability. And then also they had some free samples that they were sending out. And whereas you're not going to recoup the cost here, it's important to understand the cost of that marketing effort. Then we started looking into specific shipments. So this is a single shipment example to see how much was made or lost on this. And this is done on a customer by customer basis. Of course, we didn't share any customer information here, but this is an example where we could say, look, this particular customer that you're shipping to on a repeated basis, you are losing $65 every time you ship them an order. Now, when we queried the customer on this, their profit on these orders was about $78. So they thought they were making $78 in order. It turns out they're making $14 on this order. And this is critical information, because clearly the shipping charges for this particular customer need to be adjusted. Other ways we break down the data to look at it, and ways that are important to evaluate your strategy, is this is this customer's profit and loss per shipping method. So how much did they make or lose when it had to be expedited, when it went ground, versus when it went next day air. So it's important to understand this, because your strategy may be very appropriate for a ground shipment, but maybe a next day air you're losing your shirt, and that needs to be adjusted. So maybe it's not an entire strategy that needs to have an adjustment. Maybe it's only on particular service levels, or maybe certain service levels just need to be eliminated from your offering. So there's a lot of things that teasing this data, they bring issues to the fore that can be attacked specifically with a scalpel, instead of taking a broader kind of peanut butter spread approach. And then here we're looking at certain order types, multiple SKUs versus single SKUs, certain type of fabric versus other types of fabric. So again, breaking it down, looking at the data in different ways to understand where the current program works and where it doesn't work, and then really highlight the areas where there's an issue. Okay. There are other metrics that can really help evaluate the effectiveness of your current program. So things like, what is your cart abandonment rate at the point when the shipping rate is exposed, right? So most e-commerce folks nowadays have some type of metric that tracks cart abandonment, but it really needs to be tracked to the point where you can tell at what point in the sales cycle you're losing the sale, and see how much of that is occurring when the customer finds out when the shipping rate is going to be. right? And that can be a very strong indication on whether the shipping rate amount or the structure is turning your customers off to the sale. Look at things like reorder rates. How often are your customers reordering? Are they reordering more often or less often based on your practices? We had a customer that developed, I thought was quite an innovative strategy where they offered their B2B customers free shipping once a month. And what this did was it encouraged them to make single shipments, make one order a month instead of making multiple ones a month, to take advantage of that free shipping. And what that did for our customer was, of course, it made their inventory carrying much easier. It saved them on labor costs. They didn't have to send out shipments once a week. The once a month order was usually on the same date, so it was predictable. So it really brought some structure and continuity to their supply chain, and it made their customers happy because they got free shipping where they didn't have it before. So the reorder rate, depending on your rate structure, you could really get some control over that. Also, order size. We saw an earlier example, and I'm sure most folks are familiar with this, whereas if you spend over a certain amount, you get free shipping. If you implement a strategy like that or change the level at which free shipping is available, did that drive higher order sizes than before you implemented that? Or did it not? And that's the type of information that will really help decide whether that was a good strategy or not. And then, of course, customer feedback and expectations. Anytime you can get direct customer feedback. Of course, in a B2B environment, that's probably a little easier, but we've had customers include emails once folks have made an order. Hey, fill out the survey on your experience and you get a coupon or you get some free product. Anything you can do, even if it costs a little bit, to get specific direct customer feedback, it's usually well worth whatever the cost is. Then what are the practices of your top competitors, right? Do they have a cost advantage over you or a structure advantage over you? I've heard it all the time where folks are willing to pay more, particularly in the B2B environment, as long as the cost is simple and predictable. Right? There are a lot of times when particularly B2B customers would rather pay a $10 flat rate than an $8.87 rate one day and then an $8.97 rate the next day and then a $10.05 rate the next day. As long as it's predictable to them and they understand how it was derived, a lot of times they'll choose that over a rate that's slightly less expensive. And then take a look at your competitors, and this is something that we can assist with, and say, well, is what you're doing, is that a market norm? Is that what your customers expect to see? Or maybe are you doing something that's innovative that gives you an advantage over your competitors? Or are you 5 years behind the curve as to what everyone else in your industry is doing? So in that new strategy development, after we've really broken down your current strategy and looked at it and understood what parts of it are working, what parts are not, gotten customer feedback, looked at your profitability, then the next two primary questions that have to be answered at this stage is what is the appropriate pricing level and what is your appropriate pricing structure? And of course, depending on the diversity of the products that you offer, there may be multiple answers to both of these questions, right? As we saw earlier, sometimes the right mix is a mix and sometimes it's not, but that's something to be determined. But at this point, the appropriate level and the structure need to be determined. Okay, how should you position yourself against your top competitors? This is one of the questions we need to go through as we're developing those other two items, the price level and the structure. Are you looking to seek parity? This is often what smaller organizations do when there's a large player. They say, well, look, I just want to match what they're doing. I don't want to be at a disadvantage to them. Or sometimes, especially if you're in an industry where there's very little variance in product cost, maybe there's very little variance in other items, and the only true way to differentiate yourself is through shipping, either through shipping speed, through shipping method, through rate, or through rate structure. Maybe that can give you the advantage. We worked with a home goods distributor in California. They produce nothing. They just resell items that are provided by others. They cannot set their own product cost. That is determined by the manufacturer. So the only real, they're simply reselling other folks' goods. So the only real advantage they have is the user friendliness and effectiveness of their website and the speed and rate at which they can deliver the goods. And that's how they created their competitive advantage. Now this, I can't emphasize this enough. A/B testing can really help determine the cost elasticity of your clients. It doesn't matter how much time you spend developing your strategy, you have to test it. Okay. And I'll give you the perfect example. The customer we looked at earlier, the fabrics distributor, we did a great set of A/B testing with them. So and we had different methodologies for it, but we started out every fifth customer on their website was put into the testing environment. Now, this was seamless to the customer. They had no idea. But the first 4 customers would remain on the typical website. The fifth one would go into the testing website, again, seamless to the customer. But they faced a different shipping structure and a different method when they made their order. And then we were able to compare the effectiveness. We were able to compare the effectiveness of the orders that went to the traditional route versus those that went into the testing, right? So the comparison of those two let us see, well, in the testing environment, the order size went up significantly because of the shipping structure, or it went down, or perhaps the cart abandonment rate went up, or the cart abandonment rate went down. And so we were able to tweak things, and what we did was at 2-week intervals, we made adjustments to both structure and rate to see which ones drove higher sales or which ones hurt sales. So we were able to take a look at specific data with regards to the changes we made and see how that changed behavior. Okay, should you make shipping rates a competitive advantage or a profit center? So this is always a very important question. This is something that a lot of times it's going to depend on your position in the market, right? So where do you stand in the market? Are your customers elastic, or are they not elastic when it comes to price? So you are able to make that adjustment based on data, right? So this question is the overarching issue when determining your price point, okay? And it really needs to be answered during that A/B testing, okay? This is the first one we have to answer. How price elastic are your customers? Once this is clear, then we can attack the price structure question. Okay, and let me go back to the example of the fabrics manufacturer. So with regards to this fabrics manufacturer, we found out that as we raised the price on his B2B customers, their order size did not decline, right? So they were willing to absorb a higher shipping cost as long as everything else, the quality of the product, the speed of delivery, as long as all that stayed the same, his customers were able to absorb that higher shipping cost. And this was really important information, was completely contrary to the thoughts of the shipper when we began the project. But once we learned that, we understood, okay, we can raise the rates enough to make sure we're no longer losing money on shipping. But now what structure do we need to implement in order to take advantage of this new information? All right, so the shipping rates as a competitive advantage or a profit center question will definitely play a large role in solving what the appropriate structure should be. And again, the appropriate structure needs to be consistent, predictable, clear, flexible, and simple. All right, these are the most common structure types that we see today. First, of course, everyone's familiar with free shipping, right? Free shipping is obviously it's a fairly new development, but it's getting more and more and more common. Flat and variable flat are ones we've already talked about where, okay, it's $10 for every shipment, or maybe there's some variability based on weight or based on distance. There's the pass through, then the pass through with the upcharge, where the carrier rate is simply being passed through to the consumer. And then lastly is custom, where there's specific rates, maybe a specific matrix assigned to each of your customers. So these are the most common current structures, and they each have some very specific positives and negatives associated with them. So free shipping, the positives of free shipping. Of course, it's very simple, it's eminently predictable, it's very transparent, and it gives you a strong market position, right? These are all self-evident. The downsides of free shipping, of course, is it's expensive to the organization that's offering it. And in many cases, you may need to increase your product cost to cover the cost of that free shipping, which may make you non-competitive on product cost. Next is the flat and the variable flat. So this is flat rate shipping. First of all, sometimes it's just pure flat rate where, hey, everything is $10. Sometimes it's flat rate, but there are variability based on weight, based on geographic region and so forth. So it's also simple. It's very predictable for your customers, and it's very flexible because you can adjust the flat rate depending on again, on weight breaks, on distance, and so forth, even on particular products. The downsides of this flat and variable flat structure is it must be very carefully crafted. If you do this, you can either price yourself out of the market, or you can make yourself very unprofitable. And you may be vulnerable to competitors that are offering free shipping. Now, I'm going to give you an example here. This is a flat rate structure that we devised for some of our customers. So this, where you can see it's a flat rate across all 8 zones that UPS offers. So this is the continental United States. For 1 to 5 pounds, this customer charges $7.54. For 6 to 15, it's $7.78. For 16 and up, $10.25. So this is a flat rate structure, but there is some variability to it. But the variability is based solely, in this case, on weight. Over here, what we've done is calculated their profitability per cell. So you can see here is 15.5% is the profitability, and this is based on their own carrier contract and their own shipping characteristics. Now you can see in some instances here, especially as we get into the heavier weights, they're making a tremendous amount of profit on the local deliveries, but they're losing money on some of the further deliveries, because they're charging the same rate to deliver across the street as across the country. So in this case, what's happening is your local deliveries are subsidizing those long distance deliveries. And in some cases, that's okay. You may have customers that are completely fine with that. But sometimes you may be putting an undue burden on those local customers. And what sometimes this structure will actually drive is more and more orders from across the country. So again, this can be a very effective structure. It just really needs to be looked at and managed effectively. Now, this is another variant of that. Here you can see it's the same flat rate structure, but the country's divided into groups. So there's a zones 2 through 4, a zones 5 and 6, and a zones 7 and 8. So there's different flat rates for each one of these groupings. Now, this gets a little more complex because now you're having to manage a higher set of rates, but there's a lot less subsidization that's occurring. So you can see the profitability has dropped for the short zones, but it's not nearly as negative in the long zones. So we've reduced that cross subsidization, which is a lot of times it's perceived as a little bit more fair. Now, again, it's a little more to administer and it's a little bit more confusing, but you've lost that subsidization. So again, it's a little bit more fair to the customers that are there. And these are just several variants that we've implemented for customers. There's dozens of variants off of those. All right, so some of the positives and negatives for some of the other price structures. So there's the pass-through or the pass-through with an upcharge. So the positive of this is, in theory, if it's calculated correctly, it ensures that you will not lose any money on shipping, right? And it's very transparent. You're just telling them, listen, we're passing on whatever the carrier is billing us. So those are the positives. On the negative side, it is very seldom calculated correctly. As we saw in the example earlier, there was a $1,400 difference between what the customer's shipping system said that they were going to spend and what they were actually charged by the carrier. It's not very predictable by customers. It's not terribly flexible because it's again, it's benchmarked to that particular contract, and it's vulnerable to other structures. So flat rate structures or free shipping are often more preferable. So you may lose customers to those, and it's difficult to administer. A lot of times you have to set up an API call to the carrier websites. You have to track the changes in carrier charges. So it can be difficult to administer. A custom rate, and we see these all the time, where we'll go in and we'll work with a customer, and every one of their customers has a different format for shipping. So this one gets cost. This one's cost plus 5%. This one gets a flat rate. This one pays nothing. So it can be all over the board. So the good thing, of course, if it's customized, it's completely flexible. Every one of your customers can have a different structure. The negative side, of course, it's very difficult to administer and very difficult to evaluate. All right, so the benefits of an effective strategy. If you go through all those steps and you get it right, it often drives higher sales volume. You can have less frequent ordering, like we talked about before, if it encourages higher order amounts, which reduces your inventory and labor cost. It can really differentiate you from your competitors, right? It can give you a competitive advantage over that. Shipping can become a profit center instead of a loss that it is for many organizations, or at least if it doesn't become a profit center, we can reduce the amount of loss that you're incurring, and it can improve your customer experience. So I want to go through a little bit more of that case study that we showed some of the data on earlier. That shipper had been applying the pass-through method. Now we saw that the rates were inaccurate and inconsistent that they were passing through. So they weren't actually passing through rates accurately. There were plenty of shipments that they were making a profit on and plenty that they were losing on, and yet their goal had been to break even on every single shipment. They also had above market shipping rates with UPS. So this was a problem. The rates that they had with the carrier were not very aggressive, and their shipping system was not accurately calculating them. And when you put those two together, the fact that they were paying a high rate to begin with, and the fact that they were never quite sure what they would be paying, it was really creating some significant issues with their cash flow. They used to get a lot of customer complaints about shipping rate variance. And again, it was not the levels. Customers weren't saying, why'd you charge me $60? It was, why'd you charge me $60 this week? And last week it was $52. And the week before that, it was $87. So their customers couldn't figure out what their shipping costs were going to be ahead of time. And they had a very significant net loss every year, despite the fact that they were supposed to be passing through their rates. So the solutions we came up with was, first, we identified the product categories and SKUs where they were making money and the ones where they were losing money. And we shared a little bit of that with you earlier. Then we renegotiated their contract to get market aggressive rates with UPS. And this was critical to make sure that they had an effective contract that matched what they were shipping. Then we performed that A/B testing we talked about on both new rates and new structures to test the price elasticity of their customers, to test the pricing levels, to see what could drive more sales, to see what drove customers away. Based on that testing and the results of that, we implemented a new flat rate pricing that was based on the zones and weights, right? So they had flat rate shipping, but if the shipping was further away, it did go up. If they were ordering heavier items, that went up as well. But it was still based on flat rate. They never got a 751. It was always a $10 or $20 or $25. The results of this is their sales actually increased 9%. Once the full strategy came out of A/B testing, was actually implemented, their sales went up 9%. The prior year, they had had a net $428,000 loss on shipping charges, and that was flipped to a profit of $310,000. So that's a $739,000 improvement on shipping charges by implementing the new rates and the new structure. So the net impact of the project overall, there's 9% increase in sales led to a net profit of $966,000 on that additional 9%. The more aggressive UPS contract netted annual savings of $803,000. Then the shipping moved from a loss to a profit, which was a net gain of $739,000. So in total, the whole project, for about 4 months worth of effort, they netted $2.5 annually, or $2.5 million annually, excuse me. So obviously this was something that affected their marketing, it affected finance, it affected distribution, and in the end, the payoff was very significant. And they used part of the money to pay for a really good Christmas party for their logistics department. So keep that in mind. All right, so how is this implemented once you've tested and decided on your new strategy? How is it implemented? So first, of course, the simpler the solution, the easier it's going to be to implement, right? Again, the custom ones can get very difficult. Free shipping is obviously very easy to implement. Flat rate shipping is also pretty easy to implement. So there's different levels of complexity for implementation and maintenance depending on the strategy that you decide on. And there are also some technological constraints that may eliminate some entirely from you. We have some customers that have sought to do things like a pass-through and an upcharge, and their technology just simply wouldn't allow them to do that. So the only choice there is to abandon that option or to seek a more effective technology solution. Okay, marketing effects of this new strategy. The new strategy implementation is often going to mean some type of benefit to your customers. It could be lower rates. It could be that the pricing is simpler. It could be more predictable, more transparent, or it could be several of the above. Now, some of these may be negatives. For example, the pricing may be simpler and more predictable, but it may be higher. But there's always going to be some benefit to your customers, and you want to make sure that you're telling them about it. Right? You really want to tout, hey, we've done something different, and there may be a downside element, but there's certainly some upside elements because they will more than likely find the downside. So you want to make sure that you are, in addition to that, that you are emphasizing the upside to whatever strategy it is that you've implemented. Now let's move to monitoring. So once you've implemented this new strategy, once you've told your customers about it, a monitoring program is really critical, okay? Because things change, the market changes, you change, your customer changes. So you need to develop some industry-specific and appropriate KPIs. So what is important? Is it cart abandonment rate? Is it visit conversion rate? Is it order size increases? What is it? And of course, different elements, and whether you're selling B2B or B2C, those metrics are going to change. But you want to make sure that you have some very effective and measurable KPIs to judge the effectiveness going forward. You constantly want to keep an eye on your competitors. If one of them has come up with a new innovation or if they have switched, you need to understand whether that's something that you want to follow suit, or do you think that it's a mistake in what they're doing, but you really need to be up with what your competitor's doing. And I know I mentioned this earlier, but the more specific customer feedback you can get, the better. Through either direct comments or through metrics, however it is, solicit that customer feedback. You need to reevaluate the rate level every time the carriers have a rate increase or you implement a new contract. So we know that the major parcel carriers every year, at the end of the year, beginning of the year, they implement their GRI. but they also have rate increases throughout the year, as we've talked about on prior webinars. So whenever there's a change in how they're going to charge you, you need to go back and make sure that you're taking that into account in how you're charging your customers. And you really need to continue that A/B testing on a regular basis. It can be at a much lower level or a much less frequency, but there needs to be some kind of testing on a regular basis to try out different things to see how the market reacts to that. And at least once a year, you should look at the total program. So basically go through what we did before, look at your shipping, see if there's places you're winning or losing, get customer feedback, do some testing, and really see how you're aligned with the market, and is it still in good shape? And of course, once you've gone through the exercise once, going back and redoing it again on an annual basis will take a lot less effort, but it's important to put in that effort that is required to make sure that everything is still appropriate. So that's really everything I wanted to go over today. So I do want to open it up to questions now. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them out, and then what I will do is I'll pick some, and I'll read the ones I think are most appropriate for the group, and I'll answer them to everyone. The other thing I want to ask everyone to do, if you would, if there's a topic you'd like to hear on a future webinar, please go ahead and submit that as a question, and then we'll pull those off when we're done and include that in our roster for future webinars. So go ahead now, if you have any questions, go ahead and type them in. I'll read them out and answer them for everyone. Okay, so I got a question. How do you A/B test with a catalog element to the business? That's a great question, and actually one thing that we're honestly in the process of doing now with a distributor that still does paper catalogs. They sell online, but they still do catalogs. And what we did there was take similar customer groupings. So they have targeted catalogs, for people that have ordered once. They send one set of material to customers that order regularly. They send another set. And what we did was simply create two different versions. So if you have 1,000 customers spread across the country that order once a week, order regularly, what we did was split them in half. And of course, it doesn't have to be a half, but in this case it was, split them in half and gave one a catalog where there was a flat rate shipping, and then another one a catalog where they had free shipping over a certain amount. And we're going to, and we're in the process of that now, so we don't even have the data results come back yet. But we're going to take a look at that results and see, because it's the same group of customers, it's a random sampling throughout, there's no geographic variance in who got what. See how many additional sales the free shipping generated, if any, and then determine whether it makes sense to expand that particular offering to the entire set of customers, or whether the loss in revenue based on making up those shipping charges was not justified through the increase in sales. But you're definitely able to do it. The main thing with catalog sales is obviously the lead time is going to be much greater with regards to the printing schedules and whatnot. But it's definitely something that can be done, and if you need some help with that, again, because of our experience in doing it, then that's something we can do. All right, another one I have here, it says, can anyone really have shipping as a profit center anymore? That's a great question too, and the answer to that is it depends. There are certain industries where you absolutely cannot, right? It's so competitive, and free shipping is such the norm that your only goal there is to staunch the bleeding with regards to shipping cost. So in some cases you really can't. But in the example of the fabric shipper that I mentioned earlier, his was a loss and became a significant profit center just because in his industry and shipping mostly B2B, his customers were tolerant of the shipping charges as long as everything else was held up, as long as the customer experience was good, the speed at which it was delivered was good, the product cost was good. They were willing to absorb higher shipping costs, as long as all those other things made sense. In addition, the more appropriate shipping rates helped drive that additional sales, because he was in that scenario where there was a lot of that cross subsidization. So by eliminating that subsidization, his customers further away ended up paying a little bit more, but a lot of the local customers actually got a price break, and that definitely led to higher sales. Most of that increase in sales was in local customers. Okay, another one I have: when developing a freight strategy, is it easier and or more beneficial to move to a single carrier model? That's a question I get all the time. And the answer there is it depends as well. So the advantages of the single carrier model are mostly operational, right? You have only one carrier to deal with, one pile of packages, one pickup time. It makes it much simpler. So those are the advantages of the single carrier. One set of rates for your shipping system and so forth. The disadvantages are, of course, the different carriers have different operational and structural and even marketing advantages than others. So, for example, it's not uncommon for shippers to use UPS and FedEx for high dollar items and then use the post office for low dollar items, because the shipping, of course, costs are less than, and the quote unquote prestige of having a UPS or FedEx deliver isn't necessary for those low dollar items. So I'll give an example. In that home goods shipper we were talking about, they sell some $10,000 chandeliers. Well, that has to go UPS or FedEx, but maybe the replacement bulbs can go through the post office. So in that case, it can be effective to use two carriers. You can definitely save some money that way, but it does create some operational issues. So normally what we do is we'll present you the pros and cons of each and let you know, well, this is the advantage of going to one carrier. This is the advantages of two or more. And then for your organization, you just decide what's appropriate. Another thing to keep in mind is there are options beyond UPS, FedEx, and the post office. There are some very effective regional parcel carriers that can provide very good service in certain parts of the country, really reduce your cost and improve your time in transit. Of course, the challenge with them is now you have yet another pile of packages to make, another shipping system to deal with. So again, there's some operational hurdles, but there are some gains to be made both in time in transit and price that need to be considered. All right, here's another one that says, what options do we have if we must offer flat rate shipping? So we hear this a lot, that, hey, my competitors do flat rate shipping, I have to do it. Of course, there's a lot of options there. One is making an adjustment in product cost. Another one, as I'm sure a lot of people are familiar with, is offering free shipping, but only for certain order sizes. Another one is offering free shipping as an option, but those orders, if your customer chooses free shipping, it's a post office or a less expensive move. And if they want something expedited or something delivered with a UPS or a FedEx, then they're going to have to pay a higher amount for that. So a lot of times that's really a marketing decision. And again, it's something that we can help with to help determine what fits best and what will your customers tolerate. And a lot of times the A/B testing is critical in the answering that question. Here's another one. Is there an optimal time to undertake this type of project? I assume that means time of year, and really the answer to that is no. There really isn't. You probably don't want to be doing this during your busy season. So if you're Bob's Pool Supplies, July is probably not the best time. And if you're selling Christmas wreaths, we don't want to be doing it in December. You'd really like to have, ideally, these things ironed out before your busy season. But other than that, there's not really a specific time frame that we would have to look at. It looks like I'll take one more. how long does analysis like this take? And that's a good question too. And that really, of course, depends on the size of your organization, how many carriers you're using, and whatnot. But usually, it would take, I would say, a week to two to go through the data, to parse the data, as long as we can get it in a good format, and present the initial analysis of that. And then a lot of that depends on the strategy discussions and the testing. But in the example I gave you here, it was about a 4-month process, and that included the renegotiation of the UPS contract. And I think for most organizations that ship several $1,000,000, that 3 to 4 to 5 month time frame for all of this is probably pretty accurate. It could extend a little further. It could be faster if things are simpler, but I think that's probably a fair estimate. So I think with that, we'll close the questions. Again, please, if you submit any that we didn't get to, we can answer those. Oh, actually, I did get one more, so let me go ahead and take this one. Have you done an evaluation of additional DCs? Yes, that's something we do quite often. We call it a facility rationalization study, where we can take a look at different distribution centers in different parts of the country and let you know, this is how much it would affect your inbound cost and your outbound cost. This is how much it would improve your time in transit. And sometimes it's additional DCs, but there's a lot of organizations that can't afford to open up a new DC or to move one, in which case we can look at partnerships with fulfillment centers or 3PLs that are in those parts of the country that can open up another market to you or increase your speed to market. And you won't incur the cost of a new distribution center. So that's certainly something we can help with. The model that a lot of companies use now is exactly that, either multiple DCs or partnerships with fulfillment centers or 3PLs in order to hit that 2-day time in transit without having to pay the additional cost of air rates, which in a lot of cases you can't pass on to your customer. So it is an effective strategy. All right, well, if there's any additional questions, again, please submit them. We'll answer them either via email. And as I mentioned before, if there's any topics that you wish us to address in the future, please feel free to submit those. So thank you very much for joining us today, and I look forward to talking to you next time.